Hi folks, welcome back. So in the AI agent space, there has been so much discourse lately about skills and CLIs and MCP, and some of it is a category error, some of it is a false dichotomy, and some of it is just not considering what environment these things are meant for. So I've been building in this space for a while, and I have some thoughts that I'm hoping will clear some of these things up. All right, let's start by talking about skills. What are skills really for? Going back to the very beginning, skills have been a formalization of something that people were already doing before the notion of skills came along. That's why I call skills a desire path. This is this notion that you look for where people are walking, where the grass is worn out, and that's where you build the sidewalks. So before skills, what people would do is they would put additional context that is helpful for a task into just text files, markdown files, and they would give these files to the model through their harness or their agent or whatever mechanism it was they were using. And people were doing this very commonly when they were building agents. And Anthropic had the wisdom to formalize that into a proper spec, and then it also got these really nice properties like progressive disclosure. And the whole notion of skills is that you want to articulate some kind of either procedural or informational knowledge. So procedural knowledge is a set of instructions for how to do something. So you know what to do and you just want to tell the model. You don't want the model to have to plan or think or reason. And informational knowledge is, well, not procedural. It's not a set of steps to carry out. It's just general knowledge that will help the model on a task. So to take a very common example, if you were building a data analysis agent that was trying to query a bunch of tables, you would give that agent some general knowledge about the schema of those tables, about what the column names meant, because maybe they meant something very specific inside your company or your domain. And that would be informational general knowledge. But you would also give that agent some very specific instructions for how to query for specific tasks. Like, say you have a very specific way to close accounts at the end of the month. That is not something you want the agent to plan or reason or think about. You just spell out your process for closing the books at the end of the month. So that would be a procedural skill. The important thing about skills is that they're almost always something that is not in world knowledge. It's additional domain information, whether it's informational or procedural, that you are bringing. And SkillsBench empirically showed that curated skills, which is skills authored by humans, bring a huge jump in task performance, whereas self-generated skills, which are skills generated by the model, bring no benefit or in some cases even hurt task performance, which makes sense if you're following what I'm trying to say over here. Because again, skills are supposed to be something outside the world knowledge of the models. It's specific domain knowledge that you are bringing. So in fact, you don't want the model to generate skills for you. You want to tell the skill all your knowledge. A great example of this is actually the PDF skill from Anthropic's own official skills repo. And you'll see how in this skill they spell out common operations that one would do on PDFs. And so they just spell out how to do it instead of the model having to go look for a PDF library and try to reason and plan and all that stuff. They just say, hey, use PyPDF. You don't have to go look around for various available PDF libraries in Python. And you don't even have to plan or reason or think about how to do things like merge PDFs or split PDFs. It's such a common, well understood operation that we're just gonna explain how to do it in the skill. So that's really what skills are for. Now let's talk about MCP. What is MCP for? I think most people now have a good understanding of MCP. Roughly speaking, the idea of MCP is to bring context to the model. And once again, like the skills desire path, MCP is a formalization of function calling. Before MCP, each model provider, whether it was OpenAI or Gemini or Anthropic, they had their own slightly different syntax and API for function calling. And the big advantage that MCP brought to the ecosystem was formalizing that into a spec. The other thing MCP does, and this is less known, is it can also serve up resources. So things like HTML pages or JavaScript or CSS. And this is now being used. This is the basic mechanism that is used in things like MCP apps and ChatGPT apps. So they are basically just MCP servers, but they serve up UI via MCP resources as HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Now, all this discourse about MCP versus CLI and MCP is dead, I prefer CLIs instead, where did it start? Why did MCP get a bad reputation? And there were two technical reasons for it. One was that MCP would suffer from this problem of context hogging when a MCP and MCP server had a large list of tools. And the most well-known culprit of this was the GitHub MCP server. It had something like 70 tools, and just loading the GitHub MCP server into your agent would eat up like a third of your context window. And I would argue that is not MCP's fault. That is bad MCP server design. If you were designing an MCP server, you probably should not make it a kitchen sink of a large number of tools. You should be thinking about the right small set of tools your MCP server should have. Unfortunately, especially in the early days of MCP, there were a lot of kitchen sink MCP servers that would just eat up your context window simply with their tool descriptions. The other problem that MCP suffered from was context dumping, which means when you call an MCP tool, the results of the tool get into the window. And once again, unfortunately, there were a bunch of badly designed MCP servers which would produce very large tool results, often larger than they needed to be. And so that also ended up eating your context window a lot. Fortunately, both of these problems today have been largely mitigated by code mode. What is code mode? So the idea was initially proposed by Cloudflare, but Anthropic themselves later blessed it as kind of the canonical way to invoke MCP tools. But the basic idea is that instead of the model directly getting all the tool results and making the tool call, you would write some small amount of code to do the tool call and interpret the results. And doing it in code shields the model from both of these problems. So I think that initial reason that MCP got a bad rap has largely been fixed today. A lot of it was just bad MCP server design, but also code mode fixes the underlying mechanism. All right, that brings us to CLIs. I know there's been a lot of MCP versus CLI discourse. Peter Steinberger famously said, I really like CLIs, MCP sucks, and I think a lot of people followed him in that claim. But let's look at where do CLIs work really well. And I would claim that they work really well on what I call personal agents. These are things like me running my own agents or harness or clause on my machine, whether it is Mac Mini or VM or whatever it is. But it is my machine, I control the environment. And so what happens then is that all these CLIs auth me in. I can sign into the CLI, and once I'm signed in, having my agents use those CLIs on my behalf works really, really well. So for example, if I have a personal agent running on my own machine, I will have CLIs for GitHub and Google Cloud and Cloudflare and all the services that I'm using, and I will be signed into those CLIs. And so the agent can just invoke the GitHub CLI to do things with my Git repos. It can invoke the gcloud CLI to set up my Google Cloud projects and environments and resources, and that works really well. So the auth story with CLIs, especially on personal agents, on machines that I control, works really smoothly, really well. The other thing that works very smoothly with CLIs is context efficiency, because the agents can do agentic search over the function space of the CLI. The way that works is basically the agent can invoke the CLI with --help and learn the functionality of the CLI. And then it can do that for all the subcommands. And because it's kind of doing this tree-based search, because most modern CLIs are structured as a top-level CLI with a bunch of commands, bunch of subcommands under them, and each of those subcommands will handle some subset of functionality. Like the GitHub CLI will have a subcommand for creating repos, it'll have another subcommand for pull requests, yet another one for GitHub pages and things like that. Same with gcloud. So the agents are really good at doing this kind of subcommand search and help search over these CLIs, and that means they're very context efficient. They don't suffer from this context hogging problem that MCP had, especially when there were a large number of tools on an MCP server. So yes, CLIs do work really well for this context. But where do you not want CLIs, and where do MCPs really shine? So the thing is, in enterprise scenarios, you really do want to use MCP. You don't want to use CLIs because, well, for one, when you're doing a proper production deployment, you're deploying your own product, your own binary, and you're not deploying also a bunch of CLIs with some auth credentials just for those CLI along with your application. What you want is a proper service separation. And so if you look at the way agents and MCPs and all these things are deployed at enterprises, one very common pattern now is to separate the teams that build MCP servers and the teams that build agents. And so within large companies, you'll have a team or a set of teams that stands up the official MCP servers for the entire company. And then you will have separate teams that will use these official MCP servers to build agents on top of. And at least in an enterprise setting, this buys you lots of advantages. So with one team bringing up all these official MCP servers, you get a central governance source, and you also get one official source of truth for the underlying data. You don't want people just standing up these side MCP servers all over the place. Just like back in the day, it was not a good idea for everyone to be standing up their own side tables and fragmenting the source of truth. Ultimately, you wanted everyone to be reading and writing to one official table to keep things clean. It's a similar argument with MCP. And it buys you separation of concerns in that the teams that are building agents don't need to worry about standing up MCP servers and what the official source of truth is, and vice versa. The team that is building MCPs doesn't need to know about all the myriad agent use cases out there in a large company. All right, so that was my somewhat lengthy rant about skills and CLIs and MCPs, and hopefully that gives you some clarity on not just what these three different things are, but also where they fit, when to use them, why they're different things, and why especially CLI versus MCP is a false dichotomy. All right, if you like content like this, consider subscribing, like the video, leave a comment, would love to hear from you, and I will see you next time. Thanks.